Hello, my name is Raven. I use they, she pronouns. Welcome back to our Dice Throne Hero Spotlight series, the series where we're looking at every playable hero in Dice Throne and looking at how they play, what their cards, their board, their leaflet are like, how they compare to other heroes. And today we're going to be looking at the Shadow Thief. They're a much more complex character. They play around a lot with combat points. Be interesting to see what you think. But let's dive into the Shadow Thief. All right, here is the Shadow Thief. Shadow Thief is a bit of a tricksy character. And you'll see immediately we have something a little bit different here with 2 defense abilities. What on earth is happening there? Shadow Thief is a complexity 5 character, so we are jumping up a bit from our previous complexity 3. And you'll see why as we come to look at their different abilities and how they play and their board and their cards and their leaflet, which is where we'll start over here. So let's have a look at their dice. Here again, we've got 4 symbols, but in a bit of a different pattern. So 1 and 2, a dagger, 3 and 4, a bag, 5 is card, and 6 is shadow. So that does mean we're less likely to be hitting that dagger, but a bit more likely to be hitting that bag. So our basic ability over there is actually a little bit harder to hit than it is for our other heroes, which is interesting. But let's have a look at the status effects that we have here for the Shadow Thief. And the key one here that we really want to be spending time on is this Shadows. So it's a positive status effect with a stack limit of 1. When a player with this token is damaged as a result of an opponent's offensive roll phase, no damage is received and no defense is made. Although the attack still succeeds for things that care about that, and other effects may apply, such as status effects or what have you. Discard this token after the affected player starts and concludes a single turn while under its effects. So it's important to note that this only works against damage that happens as a result of the opponent's offensive roll phase. It doesn't do anything against isolated damage, things like poison, which we're going to look at in a moment, or many other things that might do incidental bits of damage outside the offensive roll phase, or damage from the defensive roll that the opponent might have, such as if you're against the Pyromancer that we just looked at previously. Shadows will not help you against those things, but it will help you against big attacks. So Shadow's quite a strong ability there, and certainly what the Shadow Thief wants to be getting repeatedly if they can. Then we have Sneak Attack, a positive status effect with a stack limit of 1. After attacking, a player with this token can spend it and roll a dice and add that value to their damage total. So it's a once-off. You add a die roll to your attack, so that could be an extra 1 damage, that could be an extra 6 damage. So on average, it's going to be about 3, but yeah, a little bit swingy, but can be fairly strong if you roll well, of course. Then we have Poison, which is similar to Burn in some ways. A player with this token is dealt 1 damage per poison token during their upkeep, and this has a stack limit of 3, and it does stick around. So somebody could be taking as much as 3 damage every upkeep, which is a little bit more than Burn, but obviously you have to do these in increments of 1, so you have to get 3 of them on there before it's doing that much. So 2 before it's as good as Burn, and 3 before it's even better. Okay, so we've got a little bit of an idea of the sorts of things that the Shadow Thief is playing with there. Now let's have a look at their board. So over here we have the basic ability Dagger Strike, and as we mentioned before, it's a little bit harder for the Shadow Thief to activate this ability because they only have dagger on a 1 or a 2. So 3 daggers, they deal 4. 4 daggers, they deal 6. 5 daggers, they deal 8. But then it also says, if bag was rolled, gain a combat point. And if shadow was rolled, inflict poison. So we've got some additional utility there beyond just the damage. And it does also have an upgrade that is, interestingly, free. But the difference that we have here is that you are always gaining 1 combat point. You don't need the bag for that. But if you roll card, you draw a card. So that's quite nice, having the ability to be able to draw extra cards here. So that's our basic ability. Then down here we have Pickpocket. On 2 bags, you gain 2 combat points. On 3 bags, you gain 3 combat points. On 4 bags, you gain 4 combat points. And if Shadow was rolled, up to 1 of those combat points may instead be stolen from your opponent. So they lose that combat point and you gain it. So this is a way for the Shadow Thief to be gaining additional combat points, and they can indeed upgrade this ability for 1 combat point. To be gaining 3 or 4 or 5 instead of 2, 4, 2, 3, 4. And then potentially 6 if they roll 5 bags, just all bags, gain 6 combat points. And this time, if you roll a 6, you can steal up to 2 combat points from your opponent. Now, of course, you're not dealing any damage with this ability, but it can be a nice setup for some of the other abilities that the Shadow Thief has. Why is that? Well, we're about to see. With the shifty strike, the small straight being over here, that seems a bit strange, but you'll see why in a moment when we get over to the right hand side. So first you gain 3 combat points, just straight up. Then you deal half of your combat points as damage, rounded up. So that means however many combat points you have, you deal half that amount as damage. So let's say, for instance, that when you activate this ability, you had 2 combat points. Then you gain 3, putting you up to 5. Then you deal half that as damage rounded up. So that would be 2.5 rounded up to 3. So 3 damage. So that's not a lot of damage, but you could have quite a bit more combat points than that. And here is where it's important to know how many combat points you can actually get, because there is an upper limit, and that upper limit is 15. So if you do hit that limit, instead of doing only 3 or 4 damage, now you're dealing 8 damage. So 8 damage is the maximum that you can be doing with this ability. So gain 3 combat points and deal 8 damage is the maximum that you can be doing, unless of course you upgrade it to Shifty Strike 2, which costs you 2 combat points, and now you're gaining 4 instead of 3, but you're still only dealing half of your combat points as damage. So you're not dealing any more damage, but you're gaining a little bit more combat points, which probably isn't enough by itself, but it also does give you access to this Shadow Strike ability. It needs 2 daggers and 2 shadows. You deal half combat points as damage, so same as your small straight, but you don't gain any combat points from activating it, but you do inflict poison, which is quite nice. So it's another way to be dealing damage and also inflicting poison. Then down here we have Insidious Strike, the large straight, where you gain 3 combat points, so similar to our original small straight, then just deal combat points as damage. So the total amount of combat points you have. So if you're up to that 15, you're dealing 15 damage. But if you start at 0 and you activate it, then you're only dealing 3 damage. So ideally you want to have built up some combat points before you're activating this ability. Then our upgrade costs us 2, you gain, and similar to our small straights upgrade, you're gaining 4 instead of 3, but you're still only dealing combat points as damage. But it also gives you access to this new ability, Shank Attack, where you want 1 of each symbol that you can roll. You gain 1 combat point, you gain Sneak Attack, you draw a card, and you inflict poison. So it does a little bit of all the things. you're not doing any damage, but you are inflicting poison, which will be doing damage over the course of the game. And you're also getting sneak attack, which will be doing extra damage on your next attack. Getting a combat point, drawing a card, all of that is nice stuff, even if you're not doing any damage with that ability. Then over here we have our 6's ability, but it's only 3 6's. It's not 4 6's. And in fact, Shadow Thief does not have a 4 6's ability, which I think might be unique to the Shadow Thief. So we have Shadow Dance for 3 6's, 3 Shadow. You roll 1 dice, you deal half the value as pure damage, then you gain shadows and sneak attack. So pure damage, importantly, is undefendable damage that can't be added to. So you can't add to it with a sneak attack or anything like that. You cannot increase the damage in any way whatsoever. So it's a fairly small amount of damage that this attack is actually doing. It's between 1 and 3 damage, which isn't a lot, obviously, but it is undefendable, so they can't do anything about it. And then you are gaining shadows and sneak attack, which are both really lovely, and you do want to be gaining shadows as much as you can if you are able. And the upgrade to it is Shadow Dance 2. Only costs you 1 combat point. The only addition here is you draw a card, which is nice. Being able to draw a card whenever you activate this ability is quite lovely. Speaking of drawing cards, down here we have Carducopia. Costs 2 5s to activate, and then you draw a card for each card symbol that you have on your dice. So that could be drawing up to 5 cards. Then we can upgrade the ability for 2 combat points. Again, you draw up to 5 cards. If you roll a 6, your opponent discards a card at random. And if bag was rolled, you gain a combat point. So it has some additional utility there that you can be doing. So drawing cards, getting your opponent to discard a card, and potentially gaining a combat point there as well. Then over here we have 2 defense abilities, which is kind of wild. Shadow Thief is one of, at the moment, only 2 characters in Dice Throne that have 2 defense abilities. And what that means is before you activate a defense, when you go to your defensive roll phase, you need to choose which one of these defense abilities you are going to activate. Because as you can see, this one uses 4 dice, and this one uses 5. So you can only activate one of them. So let's have a look at the 2 different defense abilities and why you might activate one over the other. So first we have Shadow Defense. We use 4 dice on that roll. On 2 daggers, inflict poison. On Shadow, gain sneak attack. On 2 shadows, gain sneak attack and shadows immediately. And in brackets it says they're ignoring incoming damage. So this is a way to ignore all damage from the attack that's coming in. And we can upgrade this for 3 combat points. All it does is gives us an additional dice to be rolling. So we have a higher chance to be rolling that double 6, gaining that shadows. So if you want to be avoiding damage, obviously this is what you want to be doing. But we do also have the option of Counter Strike, where you roll 5 dice and you deal 1 damage for each dagger you roll. And on dagger and shadow, you inflict poison. We can upgrade this one as well for 4 combat points, which is quite expensive, but keep in mind, we are gaining a lot of combat points. You deal 2 damage for each dagger you roll here instead. So, as we can see, the Shadow Thief is quite tricky. They're gaining a lot of combat points and then trying to deal those combat points as damage. But then also trying to stay in shadows so that they don't get damaged themselves. But down here, let's have a look at our ultimate ability, Shadow Shank. Gain 3 combat points and gain shadows, then deal combat points as damage plus 5. So interestingly here, If you don't have any combat points going into this, you are dealing only 8 damage with your ultimate ability. But of course, most of the time you should have much more than that number of combat points as the Shadow Thief. You have plenty of ways to be gaining combat points on your board, as well as drawing cards, which, remember, you can sell to gain more combat points. Every card you can sell for a combat point during your main phase. So you have plenty of ways to be increasing your combat points. And then a lot of the time you want to be going for these small straight, large straight abilities to be dealing damage with those combat points, particularly that large straight ability. If you can be getting that reliably, that's a lot of damage that is adding up. Then let's have a look at the unique cards that the Shadow Thief has. And we have a decent amount here. So first, our main phase cards, we have our promo card, Shadow Meld. As always, costs 0 on a 6. You roll a dice on a 6, you gain sneak attack and 2 combat points, which is very nice. On any other outcome, draw a card. So I think this is a fairly middling sort of promo card compared to what some of the others are, but it's still relatively nice. Gaining sneak attack and 2 combat points for free, essentially, is quite lovely. But it feels not quite as strong, perhaps, as some of the other promo cards that the other heroes have. Next up, we have Card Trick for 2 combat points. A chosen opponent discards a card at random. Additionally, draw a card. If you are in shadows, instead draw 2 cards. So if you're in shadows and you play this card, you get to draw 2 cards and your opponent discards a card at random, which is quite lovely. But even if you're not, them discarding a card and you drawing a card is quite nice. Being able to have extra cards is always lovely. And we have Sneaky, 1 combat point, just gain sneak attack. Just 1 combat point, gain sneak attack. Essentially this is 1 combat point to add a dice worth of damage to your next attack, unless it's that pure damage that we were mentioning before, which is fine. Sneak attack, adding that extra damage, particularly perhaps if you don't have as many combat points as you'd like and you're getting these small straight, large straight abilities and you're not dealing as much damage as perhaps you'd hope, this is a way to be increasing that damage a bit more. Then we have Wild Shadow, 4 combat points for a roll phase action. Expensive card here. Change the value of any 1 dice. If in shadows, change the values of any 2 dice instead. So the Shadow Thief gets an additional way to be manipulating dice. So every hero gets the So Wild and the Twice as Wild. This is essentially an additional one of those. It is expensive. It is 4 combat points, which is even more expensive than the Twice as Wild. But having an extra card that does that is fairly powerful. So having the option to be able to use that, even if you don't necessarily want to be spending 4 combat points to be doing that, is quite nice just having that option. Then we have a few instant cards, multiple instant cards here, which is quite interesting. So it keeps going into that tricksy side of nature that the Shadow Thief has. So first we have Poison Wound for 2 combat points. Inflict poison on a chosen opponent, which is quite lovely. It is, of course, a little bit expensive, but is quite nice if you're able to do it. Then we have Shadow Coin, which is free and just gains you 2 combat points. If in shadows, you gain 3 combat points instead. So this essentially acts as an extra getting paid. It's a free action that gives you 2 combat points, but it can potentially even give you more, which is really lovely. And then we have Enter the Shadows, costs you 4 combat points, instant action, gain shadows. So it's an additional way to be able to gain that shadows status effect. So yeah, as we can see, plenty of different ways to be manipulating what's happening, gaining extra combat points, drawing extra cards, a few ways to be gaining shadows, a couple of ways to be getting poison. A lot of the time you're going to be doing that from your defensive ability there, but you do also have a couple of ways here to be inflicting poison, including with your basic ability there. But a lot of the time you're going to be wanting to get that combat point total up as high as you can, so you're dealing large swings of damage with that large straight ability, or even that small straight ability if you can't quite get to the large straight one. And then as much as you can, getting the shadows from your shadow defense, or if you need to, from shadow dance as well. And you've got a couple of other ways to do it with your gain shadows over here. So as you can see, a little bit more of a complex hero to play around with, a little bit more difficult to get doing what you're wanting to do. A few more different things to be thinking about in terms of how they play, but quite interesting to play around with. Yeah, and so that is indeed the Shadow Thief. All right, that was the Shadow Thief. As you can see, a bit more of a complex character, got some difficulty in how they play, but still a lot of strengths to them. They're able to potentially be dealing large amounts of damage. They have ways to be gaining extra combat points, ways to be drawing extra cards, plenty of ways to be interacting with the opponent, ways to be potentially avoiding all damage that is coming at them with larger attacks. So all of those are very nice. But at the same time, they can take a while to set up. If you're dealing combat points as damage, you only start off with a couple of combat points. And so you might have multiple turns where you're only doing small amounts of damage or potentially no damage at all. And then, of course, combat points are also what you're needing to use to play cards. And so there's that push-pull of whether you're using combat points for cards or using combat points for damage. And yeah, there's some complexity and challenge involved in playing as the Shadow Thief. And sometimes it can be difficult to get that Shadow's ability as well if you're not rolling enough sixes or not activating the right abilities and things like that. So yeah, certainly some challenges involved in playing with the Shadow Thief, particularly if they're playing against more aggressive opponents who aren't giving them the time that they need to be able to really build up, and if they aren't able to get that shadows to avoid those larger attacks. Can be a bit more difficult. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Have you had a chance to play with the Shadow Thief yourself? How did you find it? Did you manage to get up to that full 15 combat points? Did you manage to get 3 poison on your opponent? What are your thoughts on how they play? Do you enjoy that challenge? Or do you find it a little bit difficult and prefer other characters? I'm keen to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. And I'll see you next time when we have a look at the monk. But until then, see you later.